When someone tries to tell you who they are, maybe you should listen. Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome or welcome back to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thanks for spending some time with me today. So today I have another review for you. This is a review of Overgrowth by Mira Grant. This is being published by Tor Nightfire in early May 2025, and I was given a complimentary copy in exchange for an honest review. And I have to say, going into this review, I am biased because I've read about, I think, 8 novels from Mira Grant as well as a novella, and I've really enjoyed everything I've read by her. So I'm obviously biased even before I pick up the book, which is good and bad, right? Because it creates all these expectations. And, Mira Grant is the pseudonym of Shauna McGuire. And as Shauna McGuire, she writes mostly fantasy. I think some of it is labeled as YA, and I haven't read any of those books. And there are much more books written under her own name than under Mira Grant. Mira Grant, she reserves for her kind of horror or horror adjacent work. And Overgrowth is no exception. Overgrowth is an alien invasion story, but our main character and our point of view is from an alien on Earth who's waiting for the invading force to come. It's really ingenious and it has a lot to say. I really enjoyed it. The story starts in almost a second-person narration, and very much I'm going to tell you a story. And the prologue is in that kind of writing style. And so right in the prologue, you're told that there was a comet, and within the comet, there was an alien seed pod, and it happened to be caught by Earth's gravity. The comet broke apart, and then thousands of seeds made it through Earth's atmosphere and planted themselves in the ground, and many of them died, but some of them grew into these plants and then flowered, and then those flowers just waited patiently for the right people to come along. And then Anastasia, a young girl, 3-year-old girl, wanders into the woods by herself behind her house when her parents are not paying attention, and she sees this beautiful flower, and then all of a sudden, the vines from that flower, like tendrils, like tentacles, they reach out, they grab her, and they cocoon her, and then drain her of all her blood. And then 3 days later, the desiccated corpse of this 3-year-old girl falls out. And then the flower blooms and a new 3-year-old girl steps out. And that is our main character, Anastasia. So she has been taken over and born anew by this alien life form. So that is our prologue. And so then we switch to a nice intimate first person for the rest of the story. And I will say I'm glad for that. I leave my discussion of the writing until later in my review, but the opening prologue that very much I'm going to tell you a story directly addressing the audience, I think is an effective writing style, but I couldn't imagine a whole 500 pages of it. So it was nice that brought you into the story. It made you complicit. It said, look, this is what is happening. You are involved in this. It brought you in, but then you get a nice first person narration. So you got to experience it through Anastasia's mind and her experiences. And the story takes place, it starts about 3 weeks before the invasion. That is always at the beginning of every chapter, it says the date, the location, and how many days until the invasion. So you know something is happening, and you also know that Anastasia really is an alien, right? So you don't ever have that doubt. Now, there are different levels of reliability and doubt that come with the narrative voice, but you never have doubt whether or not she is an alien. And you never have any doubt whether or not an invasion is going to happen. So let's start with what I love about all of Mira Grant's novels, is that her character work is really, really excellent. She always bases her novels on her characters. Her characters are like the beating heartblood of any of her novels, at least in my experience, and that is the same thing here. Our main character, Anastasia, is really wonderful. You almost could read her as on the spectrum. She is very self-contained in many ways, and part of that is because she has this compulsion whenever she meets anyone, and they ask her who she is or where she's from, she has to tell them that she is part of an alien race of sentient plants that are coming to take over Earth eventually. Or actually, no, excuse me, coming to bring her home or coming to Earth to get her, something to that extent. She has a compulsion. She can't help herself. So everyone kind of just laughs at her, right? And she is not good at making friends. So she's very self-contained. Yet she does have good friends. She does have roommates that she lives with. And those people understand her. And I really appreciate that the characters around her work, like they fit in with her in like a really, really wonderful way. So as a main character, she's interesting, she's complicated, she is not simple in any way, and she doesn't really understand who she is or why she is. Her memory of what is going to happen to her and what her home planet, quote unquote, is like and all these things is really convoluted, right? She doesn't have a clear answer. And yet at the same time, she is convinced that she is an alien, and we as an audience know that she is correct in that, but she's convinced in it, but she doesn't have any way to prove it to people. And yet she has to tell them. So she's always being mocked by people. So to find a community, a found family that doesn't mock her, that doesn't say that she's a crazy person, is a really difficult task. And yet she finds that family. So as a character, I think she's really wonderful. She's filled with doubt, but also confidence. Like, she has this quiet confidence that she knows who she is, yet she doesn't know how to express that to people, and she doesn't know what it means. She doesn't know what it means to be who she is. So as a main character, I think she's great. And then as the ancillary characters we get, people that are in her orbit that can put up with her, as well as we later meet a scientist, and that scientist's assistant, and a few other characters move in and out. And I think all of them are interesting. They work well together. They have different personality traits, and all of them feel complicated and real. Some of them are a little bit over the top, right? Or a little bit quirky, let's put it that way, but they feel appropriate for the scene. You have to imagine if your main character is this woman who tried to shape herself a life that met her emotional needs more than being focused on money or fame or popularity, because she knew that this was all going to end. If that is your main character, this woman who is incredibly intelligent, who's also an alien, and who insists on telling everyone she's an alien, of course the people that gravitate around her might be quirky in some way. So none of them felt over the top. They felt like people I would know, to be honest, and I really appreciated that. The representation and the diversity in this novel is really great. It is not really spoken of. It's not made a big point of, but there are characters of all different races, and there is a trans masculine character who is central to the story. So their differences and the obstacles they face due to those differences, none of those are made invisible. None of those are ignored. This isn't just, inclusion for the sake of inclusion. But their differences are they seamlessly fit together with each other, and it just is part of this lush narrative and this lush world building that is created in this story. And so the world building, I think, is also really wonderful. So there are two world buildings. You have this alien world building, and that comes later in the story, and I won't talk too much about it because I don't want to spoil some of that reveal. But you do have a xenobiology and like an alien world building that is done, and I think that is really well done. I appreciated it. I've been reading a lot of Adrian Tchaikovsky recently, and he excels at xenobiology and world building, at least in my opinion. And Mira Grant's is a little more open-ended, a little more rambly than his is. His is very based on like actual science, and then taking that actual human science or earth science and then tweaking it just a little bit to then see what alien life forms could result from those small tweaks. Hers is a little grander than that, yet it still feels grounded, it still feels real, and it is immersive. So it's wonderful in that way. It's inclusive, it brings you in, and it's like wonderful and fantastic. So the alien world building, when we get there, is great. But before that, you have this world building, and the story takes place in a more or less 2030 for the most part, except for the prologue. So it's near future. So, our current political climate and our current, the issues we have with climate change and so forth, those have all been tweaked a little bit. And the dials have been turned up a little bit, but more or less it's a world you recognize. And so there isn't too much work done to build like the world they live in. Instead, there is an emotional landscape and a sociological landscape that is being built. And that's the world building that's done. And you do that through the perspective of our main character, Anastasia, or Stasia, as she's called by her friends. And I think that is also really skillfully done because you feel the connections between these people and you feel the pressure points between people. And so you are, again, involved in this world. I think because Mira Grant is so great at creating character and then basing her story around character, then the world building is a natural offshoot of that, and you really feel like you're involved in whatever world has been created. So the character work and the world building is really fun. Now the story itself is great. The story is almost exactly what you expect from the jacket copy, right? That this woman knows she's an alien. She tells everyone she's an alien. No one really believes her, and her friends and her partners, they believe her, but it's not really clear if they believe her or if they're simply tolerating her. So there is always this tension, even with the people she loves and cares about. But she knows she's an alien and that there's an invading force coming. And as the invading force is getting closer, more things are waking up in her mind. And she's having dreams that connect her to other aliens that may or may not be on Earth, who had similar experiences as she did, being born from a flower in the middle of the woods and so forth. So the world is getting more intense as the story progresses, and the actual invasion that does happen, it happens about 2/3 of the way through. So those first 2/3 are building up to it. And then what are the consequences of that invasion, and what is her role in that invasion? So to a certain degree, that storyline is somewhat exactly as you'd expect it to be, based on the the log line of the story. What is beautiful about it is Grant takes this really simple storyline and she adds so much complexity through the characters, through the decisions they have to make. And, there are these twists and turns and multiple folds. So what could be a very simple story is instead really rich, right? It really brings you in. And the writing adds to that because so most of the story is from this first person perspective. So you are living with Anastasia. You're living with her doubt, with her fear, with her confidence, with her knowledge that she is more than what everyone believes her to be, that she isn't crazy, but she doesn't have the means to explain that in a meaningful way to get people to believe her. So all of her relationships are tortured in some way. And her experience of what is coming and what has happened, it isn't 100% clear. So you're living through her, and the writing reflects that. It is really descriptive. It is really interior. There's a lot of emotionality to it, yet it never feels like purple prose. It's always prose that is inviting, that brings you into the experience, which for me is a dynamic way of writing that is really compulsive, right? I really want to be involved in that way. So I appreciated the writing very much. I will say the plotting was a little bit slower than I would have liked. It's not slow by any stretch of the imagination. I'd say if you have to scale it, I'd say it's the plotting and the pacing rather is a good medium pace. Like I said, the aliens do invade, but that happens 2/3 of the way into the story. Now, having read other books by Mira Grant, especially the Newsflash trilogy, which has a much more frenetic pace, I was anticipating this to be a little faster than it was. And I suppose having read other novels of hers, like Into the Drowning Deep, I should have expected that there's a little more of a slow buildup and then a lot of action near the end. And I wasn't really anticipating that. And yet, having said that, I actually grew to appreciate the pacing, because if I look at all of the pieces of this story, I think they all work together perfectly. They build upon one another, and they're showing a complete picture, a complete whole. So a lot of times, if I have the feeling that a story is going slowly or the pacing isn't quite up to snuff, I can usually point to a section that feels drawn out, that feels like it is just overstuffed, or I can point to a section that, maybe that section isn't needed at all. So when I have that feeling of a story going slowly, I can usually at least have a general idea of what needs to be massaged to speed it up. And that's not the case here. So in this book, I couldn't see anything that I would want to change. I think the way it is layered, the way it builds on itself is great, and it works perfectly. It just isn't as frenetic as I was anticipating it to be. So if you go in and you're expecting this really high energy, frenetic alien invasion story with lots of action scenes from the start to the end, then you're going to be disappointed. But if you expect this meditative exploration of what it means to be human and what it means to know yourself and how that then develops into an alien invasion story, then you are going to have a lot of fun with this. So once I settled into the pacing, I was actually really happy with it. And looking back on it, having finished the story, I think it worked really well. And there are some really exciting action scenes, including a few incredible action scenes near the end that I was not expecting at all. The introduction of new characters that came out of nowhere that really, the story set itself up for them, right? They weren't like a Deus Ex Machina. They weren't, like pulling the rug out from underneath you. The story built up a world where these new characters that came in made sense, yet I was not anticipating them. So when they were revealed and they entered into the story and they entered into the action of the story, it was a surprise, but it was a surprise that she had warned you that she was going to give you. And it was great. So the pacing, it worked for me, but you have to be prepared for it not being like a really high energy and frenetic the whole way through. And to some extent, the writing reflects the pacing, because the writing is really reflective. The writing has a lot of interiority, and that goes with the ideas that Mira Grant is asking in this story, which is, I think, one of the most fun parts about it. The story is about, what does it mean to know yourself? What does it mean to know who you are, to be confident about who you are, and yet to have no one believe you are who you say you are? And like I said, there is a trans character in the story, and you see Anastasia's life experiences to some extent paralleled in this trans character's experiences, and the idea that they know very well who they are in the world and who they are in their body, and yet the world at large isn't willing to believe them when they say, I know who I am. That struggle of knowing who you are and not being believed is paralleled in these multiple characters, and I don't think it cheapens it. I think it strengthens it. And it highlights this experience of feeling like an alien, feeling like no one understands me, no one knows who I am, yet I'm confident in myself, and I have a truth in my mind or in my heart that I'm not willing to sacrifice to make other people comfortable. So that story, I think, is told really well. Now, in any kind of invasion story, any alien invasion story, especially when there are, sleeper agents, there's also like a xenophobia element of, can you trust your neighbor? Do you know who your neighbor really is? And that's also explored here, not as explicitly as the self-reflection, but also, what does it mean to know your friends? What does it mean to know others? And when someone tells you something about themselves, what does it mean to actually believe them? To take them at their word, no matter how outrageous what they say might be. So much of the conflict in this story comes from people not listening or people not believing when someone says, I know this important truth about myself and I'm willing to share it with you. And then instead of accepting that truth, denying that truth's existence and laughing at that truth. That is where this conflict comes from, this inability to be willing to be open to others. So the story has this really wonderful opportunity for reflection. But what does it mean to know yourself? What does it mean to share a part of yourself? And what does it mean to know others? And then on top of that, as our main character grows and as this invasion looms, she has this split loyalty, right? She grew up as a human. She's around 30 years old at the point of the story happens. So she's lived her whole life as a human. She, for all intents and purposes, was born on Earth. Yes, an alien seed, descended onto Earth, but she was born from that alien seed on Earth, right? She wasn't born on an alien planet. She didn't travel here. That seed itself was not sentient. It wasn't sentient until it consumed this young girl, and then it became sentient through the consumption of that young girl. And as a result of that, she is human in many extent, or she feels an association with humanity. Yet she also feels this pull to her real home, to her real family. And so she has this constant conflict of who am I loyal to, and how can I be loyal to two different people or two different sides that want different things? And is it possible to be a bridge between those two things, or do I have to choose? Do I have to make decisions to sacrifice one part of myself in order to celebrate the other part of myself? That, I think, is a really interesting question that all of us can explore deeply. What does it mean to know who you are and to recognize that in order to fully be yourself, there might be parts of you that you have to sacrifice? Is that true, or are there compromises that can be made when trying to understand what it means to exist in the world, what it means to exist in society, but also in your own skin as a human being? So in this wild alien invasion horror story, Mira Grant is doing a great job of having this really reflective dialogue about not only what it means to know yourself or to know others, but what it means to be willing to accept the most difficult parts of yourself, the scariest, the most jagged, the most horrific parts of yourself, right? What does it mean to accept those parts? And can those parts be reconciled with the part of you that is soft and squishy? Ultimately, though, this is also a story about family and about finding your family, about finding your tribe, about finding those people whose roots intertwine with yours. And so in that regard, I think there is a lot of emotion in this story. There's a lot of heart, and the story is tackling these philosophical ideas, but doing it in, this really wonderfully fantastic way that is just a lot of fun to go with. So I think those are about all my thoughts. I think the story has great character work. That character work is the heart of the story. From those characters, a really well-developed world, both the human world, like the emotional human landscape, as well as an eventual alien landscape, are both really well developed. They're immersive. They pull you in. The story itself, I think, is both simple and complicated at the same time. It takes a very simple narrative arc, and then within that simple narrative arc, it adds complexity, it adds folds, twists, and turns, and lots of moral dilemmas that our characters have to face. The plotting, in terms of the actual plotting, I think it is well thought out and it works well together. It isn't as fast-paced as some people might like. It does have a deliberate pacing, but that worked for me once I was ready to accept that. If you go in and, like me, I went in expecting it to be fast-paced, and so when I get through the first chapter and it wasn't that way, I had to readjust my expectations. Once I did that, I was really happy with the pacing and the plotting and the story. The writing, again, complementing both the character interiority and the work being done with the characters, but also complementing the plotting, being really descriptive and really imaginative, but also having this emotional and reflective nature that pulls you into the story and makes you want to keep turning pages. That is one of the ways I know that even if a story isn't going as fast moving as I kind of want it to be, if I'm on board with the pacing, then I can usually tell that by how much I want to turn the page. And, at the end of the night, when I am getting too tired to read, if I'm trying to fight to turn another page because I want to see where this is going to go. And that was the case with this novel. I fought for every page I could read. Whenever I was running out of time, or I had to go somewhere, or had other obligations, I read to the very last syllable that I could. So that, at least from my personal experience, tells me that the pacing worked, because the pacing was in line with the story being told, and I had to get on board with that. But once I was on board, I didn't want to leave it. So that worked for me really well. And then the themes, the ideas that are being explored, and the way that representation is used to explore those ideas, and the way of feeling like an alien, not just being an alien, but the idea of feeling like an alien, which is to say, feeling like you know who you are, but other people don't accept you for who you are, even though you are willing to tell them and you want to share yourself with them. They don't accept that. How to live your life like that? What does that mean? How do you form connections with others? Is it possible to form connections with others who will never really believe a fundamental truth about yourself? And if they aren't willing to believe that about you, what kind of responsibilities do you have for them when their planet is being invaded? When their happiness is at stake, what kind of responsibility do you have? If they spent their whole life merely tolerating you or placating you, then what is your responsibility to humanity in that regard? To a humanity that has rejected you largely. I think they're wonderful ideas explored in the story, and I had a lot of fun with it. So that, I think, is all I have to say. as you can very clearly tell, I had a great time with the story. It did not let me down. Having read Mira Grant's other novels, this like fit right in with her writing style, with her prose, and with what I've come to expect from her novels. And I'm really glad that I got a chance to read it. I hope all of you get a chance to read it. If it sounds interesting to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts about it down below. Or if you've read any of Mira Grant's other stories, please share your thoughts about those down below as well. And if you've read any of the work she has written under her actual name, Shauna McGuire, I'd love to hear some recommendations from there as well, because she's written quite a lot and I haven't jumped into any of it. So if you know any of those stories or any of those novels, and there's an entryway that you want to support or recommend, I'd love to hear your thoughts about it and anything else down in the comments. But for now, I'll say thank you for spending some time with me today. I appreciate you. Please be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.